From the library of the New York Stock Exchange at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in New York City, you're inside the Ice House, our podcast from Intercontinental Exchange on markets, leadership, and vision in global business. The dream drivers that have made the NYSE an indispensable institution of global growth for over 225 years. Each week, we feature stories of those who hatch plans, create jobs, and harness the engine of capitalism. Right here, right now at the NYSE and at ICE's exchanges and clearinghouses around the world. And now welcome inside the Ice House. Here's your host, Josh King of Intercontinental Exchange.
This month, as all fans of Outlander know, we mark the 275th anniversary of the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the final confrontation of the Jacobite Rebellion, where Scottish Highland clans under Bonnie Prince Charlie succumbed to British forces led by William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland. After early victories in Edinburgh and Prestonpans, Charles Stuart, the Bonnie Prince, could have taken his army of Scots all the way to London had not the Redcoats recalled 12,000 regulars from the continent to put down the insurrection, resulting in 2,000 Scots killed or wounded, effectively putting an end to the Highlands' culture and way of life. The only thing that most of us have left are single malts. 270 years later, in June 2016, Britain began its march to leave the continent again, this time through a referendum rather than the movement of troops. That moment 5 years ago, in which 52% of voters opted to leave the European Union, was far more surprising. As markets reacted, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 610 points, or 3.4%, to end the day at 17,400. While many said the British culture and way of life might suffer from being severed politically from Europe, markets, they shrugged it off. The Dow is double what it was 5 years ago, and by judging how Britain weathered COVID next to its neighbors across the channel, perhaps the Brexiteers were onto something after all. But getting to the end state would be as hard as a slog through the Scottish moors. From that day in 2016 began 3.5 years of negotiation, discussion, and debate. The comedians made their jokes, the papers printed their headlines, and the politicians were in constant conversation with counterparts in Brussels during what became known as the transition period. Questions of deal or no deal were constant, but finally the day came. At 11 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on New Year's Eve, December 2020, the transition period ended and the UK was out. And yet, that's not where the story ended, not by a long shot. The headlines have continued to talk about Brexit with a high fever. Just this week, the bankers in the UK say they're being left out to dry while negotiations over the so-called equivalence hasn't progressed beyond a memorandum of understanding with Brussels. And British chocolatiers are having a hard time exporting their sweets to the continent, and clothiers, florists, and purveyors of sausages are similarly struggling. Even the delicate political balance in Northern Ireland has been shaken in recent days by violence, as a new UK-EU trade deal has imposed customs and border checks on some goods moving between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. In response, Amsterdam, once the financial center of the world, has seized the chance to sell itself once again as the financial center for the EU, a bid to take back the European crown it first lost to London nearly 3 centuries ago. But London, it's not going away quietly. The UK believes firmly it's able to control its narrative and shape its future. The stakes of the outcome may be greater indeed than the question of whether the Stuarts could restore their place in the British monarchy. Where Brexit came from and where it takes Britain from here is our topic for discussion with today's guest, the Accidental Brexiteer, Barney Reynolds, partner at Shearman & Sterling, one of the world's top law firms, where he also holds the position of global head of the financial services industry group and is also a member of the firm's executive group. Our conversation with Barney Reynolds on all things Brexit will begin right after this.
Whether it's markets, exchanges, or networks, connection makes everything possible. The connection between data and technology, innovation and expertise, and most of all, between people and opportunity. For over 20 years, ICE has transformed markets, products, and processes to make things work better, faster, smarter. From modernizing energy and commodity trading to revolutionizing the bond markets. Whether it's the world's largest stock exchange or the dream of home ownership, we do more than see the big picture. We create it. You may not know our name, but we bet you know our network. ICE. Make the connection.
Our guest today, Barney Reynolds, is a partner at the law firm of Shearman and Sterling, where he specializes in all things impacting financial markets. Barney studied law at the University of Cambridge. After completing his studies, he joined Shearman and Sterling, where he's worked for over 18 years. His voice is well known throughout the City of London, having penned seminal documents and books on the future of financial services following Brexit, including The Art of the No Deal, How Best to Navigate Brexit for Financial Services. Barney, welcome inside the Ice House.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Nice to be here.
So perhaps there's a future for you in chocolate smuggling if this financial services law thing doesn't work out for you?
I doubt it. I don't think I have any special skill in that. But no, I'm positive on Brexit, so I don't think it'll come to that.
So where were you 5 years ago this coming June? Bring us back to that moment for you.
I was quite happily advising clients, financial institutions around the world on City of London and European legal matters, and then the referendum came along, basically.
You've certainly made a name for yourself in the half-decade since as the Accidental Brexiteer, but what drew you to the law before that point, and how did your specialization narrow into financial services?
Well, I did a law degree. I was interested in becoming a lawyer quite young. In our country, you can either go into the law by doing a law degree and then carrying on, or you can do something else first and then go into the law. I knew I wanted to do something related to the law. And then just started practicing and learning the skills, and have enjoyed it and never looked back.
Is there a particular aspect of financial services law that grabbed your attention, that really drew you in?
I love the way that it's the sort of plumbing of how everything works. So, and it's constantly evolving. It's hugely complicated, but underneath it are all sorts of pro-business elements. And I love the way that one's at the intellectual heart of sort of shaping how the markets operate.
Many factors contributed to the eventual outcome, Barney, with people deciding based on their views on issues ranging from immigration to legal autonomy, which you and I have talked about in the past. If you had to sort of tick off the top factors leading to Brexit, what would you say they were, and why did they drive that majority to 52%?
I think it's about sovereignty. I really do. I think the population, the public, ultimately want to be in charge of their own affairs, and it's about democracy as well, because the Westminster democratic system is centuries old, tried and tested. It works very well. People have a very direct say in who represents them and in deciding on which views to support. And people get removed very quickly if it goes wrong. The EU system has elements which try to sort of import democracy into the EU architecture with the European Parliament and so on, but it's far less directly connected to the people than the Westminster system. And I think that's ultimately what drove it. Obviously, there were other topics very much under discussion at the time, immigration being one of them. And I suppose the point, I see that as a sovereignty point as well. The point there was, the politicians were basically being told by a large segment of the public to do something about it. And the EU law said you can't do anything about it. And David Cameron, the Prime Minister at the time, went over to Brussels to try and negotiate a change to the EU arrangements. so that the UK government could sort of apply some sort of emergency brake on immigration. And effectively, that was brushed aside by Brussels. And so I think it was a sort of indicator of a lack of preparedness of the EU system to accommodate direct democracy from the UK. And I think that really was the sort of spark, perhaps. But I think it represents a far bigger underlying point, which was there all along and was only getting worse. As, in fact, I suppose the other point was the continent of Europe is integrating faster. You'd have a twin speed EU developing to some degree anyway because of the Eurozone. So after German reunification and the construction of the Eurozone was becoming almost a sort of block within a block in its own right. And another thing which Prime Minister Cameron had tried to do was to negotiate a relationship between the sterling area and the euro area within the EU construct. And that was, to my mind, not finished business, and it was not a satisfactory outcome. It was a right to negotiate. So I think there was an emerging split coming from that down the line as well, and we're seeing all the issues in the Eurozone, which would not be the UK's issues. So within the EU construct, I think we'd be having somewhat similar discussions on some topics anyway, even if the UK had voted to stay in by some narrow majority.
So before we dive in much deeper to the work of Mr. Cameron, Mrs. May, ultimately Mr. Johnson, and the last 5 years, let's take a little bit of a sidebar and talk a little bit about this esteemed firm that you work for. Thomas Shearman, John William Sterling founded a litigation practice that represented one of the robber barons, Jay Gould, and also the founder of the assembly line, Henry Ford. Today it has about 850 attorneys under senior partner David Beveridge. Talk about your firm for a minute.
So it's, as you've indicated, a New York headquartered firm. It's a global law firm with a long and storied history, having worked on an extraordinary number of very famous deals and developments in law all over the world, played a role even in the Iranian hostage crisis, finding a route through for various payment flows there and securing of monies. So, no, it's a wonderful firm. I've been very happy ever since joining in September 2002 and haven't looked back.
So, Barney, on June 24th, 2016, you published a client publication for Shearman & Sterling in which you wrote, and I'm going to quote you here, "One key element of any deal from a financial services perspective will be the status of financial services passports." So the discussion of passports, with the term evolving somewhat over the years, has really been at the heart of the debate from the start, hasn't it?
Yes. So within the EU legal architecture for financial services, starting in 1989 with a sort of prototype, an early version, and then really taking off since about 1999 and then sort of cemented after the financial crisis, there's been a rolling out of pan-EU regulation, which has supplanted national law and regulation for financial services, and that includes in the City of London and the UK. UK obviously having played a big part in writing that, but not the sole part. It's a committee-based construct, effectively. And the idea of the passport is that a financial firm set up in one member state can operate across the whole EU. And as the passport's evolved, it operates under one rule book across the whole EU, overseen by the supervisor in the place where it's incorporated. And that architecture obviously fell away on Brexit. And it's something I talked about in the run-up to the referendum as having to be looked at and thought through. And the piece you're citing was where I started writing about the solutions. But yes, we'd be moving, on Brexit, we'd be moving out of the architecture of EU law and regulation and out of the passport infrastructure. The question is, what would be best for financial services based in the City of London afterwards?
As we've been having our discussions over the last few weeks, Barney, this term has come into my head as the accidental Brexiteer for you. You're not sort of greatly politically motivated. You look at this from a basically law and financial services perspective. What were your views on the European Union probably before the referendum, and how did your career shape them up to that point?
I've always been Eurosceptic, and in fact, my work in the financial services sector and in EU regulation, in the sort of weeds of some of the detailed stuff which involved the collaboration with other states in creating the passport regime, made me even more skeptical than I naturally was, I think, because I saw the way in which law and regulation is used for political purposes in continental European countries, many continental countries, and I've started to reflect on why that was. And I think at root, part of it is to do with a fundamental difference between the common law UK way of thinking, and Scots law's not materially different in this context, which is basically bottom-up, sort of case-by-case, iterative, pragmatic, and instinctively respects the idea of a market. It intervenes only when there's something to intervene on. And the civil law top-down codified thinking that originated principally in France and Germany in the 19th century, which is more controlling, perhaps more consistent with a mercantilist way of thinking, which seeks to control the market and uses law and regulation as a vehicle for political choice. And I saw that in the discussions around the creation of the EU regime and the big tensions there and the different ways of thinking about the market. And I think those tensions have only got more acute. And I think it became even more obvious with the construction of the Eurozone and the attempts by some countries in the EU to control the euro currency through controlling clearing of the euros, through floating the idea of a financial transactions tax to recoup the costs, various costs as they saw it from the financial markets, or at least to skim off some money from the markets and redistribute those. It was a very different way of thinking, and I could see those tensions bubbling up.
The Brexit negotiations have been long and fraught, as we talked about in the introduction. It's a topic stretching really across the tenures of three prime ministers, with bills and EU withdrawal deals failing to pass Parliament due to a lack of consensus among the UK's politicians. Those three prime ministers, Cameron, May, Johnson, all Conservatives. How have they each handled, in your view, the prospect of leaving the EU?
Well, David Cameron's approach was very normal, I think, which was to seek to renegotiate the EU construct to some degree. Not enough, as it turned out. I didn't think it was going to be enough at the time to satisfy the British public. And very minimal changes were, in fact, agreed to by the EU as part of that process. But he and those helping him believed that the EU could be fixed with some adjustments. Some of those adjustments were sort of rights to carry on negotiating and talking. So it would have been an evolutionary discussion on the current architecture. But I think, personally, as I've mentioned, I think the two sort of ways of thinking are too far apart for that really to have worked. The second approach was the most extraordinary of Theresa May's premiership, where she tried to sort of square the circle. I'm not even sure whether one could describe it as achieving Brexit fully, because it would have involved the UK adopting EU law, i.e. foreign law, and the adjudication of a foreign court and a foreign executive authority in the context of the European Commission for State Aid, which to my mind is an extraordinary idea. I don't, if you put the idea to the US or any other normal sovereign country that they would take someone else's law, I think they'd laugh you out of court. So that was an extreme moment, I think, for us, and it was rejected by Parliament 3 times, thankfully. So our democratic system held up, the checks and balances held up, and so effectively the executive branch was unable to deliver on what I think was a sort of steamrollered approach pushed by the EU in order to try and avoid what was termed a hard Brexit. I don't think that was anything to be afraid of, but a lot of people were. Theresa May's government clearly decided they wanted to avoid it. So they were prepared to sign up to this extraordinary thing, but Parliament rejected it, thankfully. And then now Boris Johnson's government, I think, is a very sensible and strongly led government, which is looking for sovereign-to-sovereign arrangements as being the solution. And so for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement agreed this year, or at the end of last year, which came into effect this year, you see a normal free trade agreement between the UK and the EU, which is a basis for future discussions. I'm sure it can be improved upon, but that's normalised. So that's how I'd see those things. And so there was, in a way, a side track that we took for the Theresa May administration, for the duration of that, which was somewhat extraordinary. And I think in legal and constitutional terms, it was particularly extraordinary. And it was a complete dead end. And it would have, I suspect, never happened if Boris Johnson had been elected that first time round. I think we'd have probably got to the right result, or a sovereign result, much, much more quickly. Possibly even had a US trade deal in place by now. But anyway.
Let's talk about your role in all this, Barney. The Star Chamber was originally established in the 15th century as a court consisting of judges and privy councillors. Its purpose at the time was to supplement the regular justice of the common law courts. It was abolished in 1641, resurrected in 2019 by the European Research Group to advise and comment to the then Prime Minister, Mrs. May, on the Brexit deal. You were enlisted as a member of this Star Chamber. Can you tell us more about it and the work that it entailed?
Well, I didn't have any hand in naming it. It's obviously nothing to do with the original Star Chamber, and it's a slight joke title, I think. I mean, in the sense that it's just a legal advisory group for backbench MPs who wish to evaluate the sort of agreements reached between the UK and the EU and other legal issues arising on Brexit. And so in particular, in the context of the May agreements presented to Parliament, they wanted independent advice on what those actually achieved, because there was a huge concern as to whether or not they gave up sovereignty in various respects, which they did. And then the final sort of hurrah of the legal advisory group, which I'm proud to have been a member of, was at the end of last year when it was reconvened to look at the Boris Johnson Trade and Cooperation Agreement. For all I know, it'll be convened again to look at any future Northern Ireland arrangements and other sovereignty arrangements. But essentially, it's to look at sort of structural legal points between the two countries and advise back, or two jurisdictions rather, and advise backbench MPs who before they decide how to vote.
So you say it could be convened again. I'm curious, in your view, what are the areas that still require finessing, such as equivalence?
Well, so you've touched on one. Financial services, there will need to be an arrangement of some sort, and I think it will be enhanced equivalence, an arrangement I conceived, originated, and created treaty and regulatory text for. The UK government then adopted it in 2018 as its policy. It still is the policy. That will potentially need to be looked at if some arrangements produce along those lines. At the moment, the EU are showing no inclination to do that. There are unfinished points of business in relation to Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Protocol encroaches unacceptably on UK sovereignty, which is why, in my view, it's an unstable arrangement for the Northern Ireland Irish people. And there are some other ones, for instance, citizens' rights, where the role of the ECJ lasts indirectly for up to 100 years. Questionable arrangements for the sovereign bases in Cyprus, and the role of the ECJ in relation to various other aspects of the withdrawal agreement. So there are points to be cleaned up, there's no question.
The UK had granted equivalence to Switzerland's trading venues. What do you think are the benefits of this for the UK?
So under the equivalence architecture, which the UK was key in conceiving and then rolling out in EU law, and is therefore part of inherited UK law, because at the point of Brexit, from the beginning of this year, all the EU acquis, as it's called, the EU body of law was adopted into the UK. And therefore we have equivalence provisions like the EU did or does. It allows, the provisions allow the recognition of certain jurisdictions and rules in certain jurisdictions, so that instead of regulating, providing restrictions on the access of businesses under those foreign laws to the UK, you sort of effectively allow full access, recognizing the efficacy of those laws and the regulators managing the application of those laws, so as to allow people to trade here. Now, it's a much smaller point in relation to the UK than it ever is for the EU, because basically the UK has the most open market in the world of any major market through its so-called overseas persons exclusion, which allows people to interact with market participants anywhere in the world without the UK seeking to regulate those other participants. As a general matter, the equivalence regime for share trading and so on operates under the inherited EU acquis. Whether we should bother with equivalence mechanics for some of these things going forward is an open question. I suppose they provide bargaining chips for the EU negotiations for financial services over time. But I think the UK's history of allowing people here to trade wherever they want on a caveat emptor basis in the wholesale markets is the best way forward, actually.
So now that the UK has left the European Union, do you see the UK having to adapt its regulatory regime? What's the future? Well, what do you think the future will be for financial services in the UK?
Well, I think so this goes back to the law. The common law system, there are three main legal systems in use around the world on which everyone else's are basically modelled. There's the common law system used in the US and the Commonwealth, and obviously the UK. There's the codified French version of the civil law system used in a number of countries around the world. And then there's the codified German law system used in other countries around the world. Some countries amalgamate those two to some degree. China and Japan, for instance, have systems based in large part on the German code system. In China's case, with Soviet law in there as well, and some other influences. So those are the three systems people have developed and found to be the best ways of interacting and organizing society in the world. The EU system basically has ended up adopting the Franco-German codified model. And the way that works is that you have a code which covers every area of activity pretty much, or a legislative framework and rules covering every aspect of activity. And so for financial services, further to the Financial Services Action Plan of 1999, we now have a single EU, and further steps taken subsequent to that, we have a single European, or EU rather, rule book which covers all of financial services, with a rule for pretty much every financial services type of activity. And and this method brings with it certain consequences. So when a new thing happens, new development like crypto, Bitcoin or whatever, there's a full-time secretariat at the European Commission that will be looking at the markets, seeing whether something new is coming up, and writing a new block of code. It's like a bit of software that constantly gets updated, iOS 10 or whatever, 10.1, 10.2. And the common law method is completely different. It's bottom up, and there's a massive deference to the independent judges to produce case law precedent. And they delineate effectively what is permitted, and then you can extrapolate from that with astonishing degrees of predictability to what would happen in a new situation if you want to do something innovative. And then on top of that, you have regulators who make rules and legislators that make laws, but they do so in a light touch way where they focus on specific mischiefs. And you're obviously familiar with this from the US. But there's a very, very stark difference in method. And the EU method, which we've been part of, and we made work sufficiently whilst within the EU for financial services, although I foresaw problems ahead with the Eurozone setup in particular and mission creep of this method. We've taken in the point at the beginning of this year, all relevant EU financial services law. And so what I think we need to do is lift off that blanket of code from the UK system and rewriting and replacing, leaving us with a common law-based financial regulatory system, which would have the benefit of all the certainty, legal and regulatory certainty you get from the common law method and predictability. which avoid you doing something which you have to do under the codified system, which is constantly asking officials for permission to do things. In the common law system, you can actually go to a private practice lawyer, or you can evaluate for yourself whether something's permitted on the basis of the precedents, and then you can go and do it on the basis that you'll have equal treatment and your arguments will be given equal respect to them in the courts.
Taking the long view, what are the economic opportunities facing the UK in your view now that Brexit has occurred?
Well, there's a lot of economic research by people like Cross, Laporta, Mahoney, and so on. Actually, American, principally, economic research to the effect that the common law system leads to significantly greater economic growth than the civil law code-based system. Because the method, and it's explained by the method, the code has to sort of keep jolting to catch up with market developments, and in areas that which involve considerable innovation and intellectual energy, where people want to be able to innovate, they want to know that if they do X, Y, and Z, they can actually do what they're wanting to do. The common law system provides you with that certainty, and so it tends to coincide with greater levels of innovation. And that's the prize, in my view, for the UK to recapture that. We had it in the 19th century. I think it's relevant far more now in a services-based world than an industrial one. For financial services, there's a constant adjustment going on, and you want to minimize the moving parts and make it as clean, as simple as possible, allow everyone's intellectual effort to be focused on where real risk is and what really matters. The civil system, by defining rights as well as obligations and putting them in tension with each other, by just juddering to keep up with the market, always being behind, innovators tend to disengage from that environment. And that's the benefit. And the economic research bears that out.
So greater levels of innovation are in the offing for London's future as a financial center. Barney, Amsterdam overtook London as the center for share trading. We've also heard the phrase Singapore on Thames mentioned frequently in regard to London's potential evolution. What do you think will happen to London?
Well, Singapore on Thames is shorthand for a common law, highly competitive market economy. And I very much hope we go in that direction. But obviously, Singapore has a lot of other things that go with that. The UK makes its own political choices. So it's only a shorthand reference. I don't think it's accurate as to what the destination will be for the UK. EU law said that EU companies' shares have to be traded in an EU exchange. And then, people on that particular topic chose Amsterdam. There is no one EU financial centre. I think what the UK needs to do is embrace its legal and regulatory method. I think that will bring more innovation. I think the other factor that will change the whole market very considerably as well is that at the moment, wholesale services can be accessed from all over the world in London, subject to any local law restrictions on their systems and so on. But they can be accessed very easily by sophisticated players, and they can set up a place of business here. They can use reverse solicitation, which is a concept of reaching outside your laws and only being subject to the protections of the UK system, which are obviously, in my view, first rate. The consumer is going to be able to access the UK's financial services from anywhere in the world on smart devices in ways which I don't think countries are going to find it sensible to try and do anything about. And so long as the UK maintains a trusted reputation for hosting high-end financial services providers that constantly deliver value and have the best liquidity and products, then I think you'll see in the retail market the same thing as we've got in the wholesale market. And I think that's the biggest prize available to the UK.
Pursuing the biggest prize available after the break, Barney Reynolds, partner at Shearman and Sterling, will move beyond London to talk about some of the broader issues in global financial services, always as it has to be against the backdrop of the economic and legal revolution we've been witnessing these past 5 years. That's coming up right after this.
Historical data can offer insight into the direction of markets. Yet data processing, collection, and storage can be challenging and costly. To simplify your data access needs and help find efficiencies, we launched ICE Data Vault, a cloud-based platform that enables you to access tick history for global exchanges, as well as our proprietary data, sourced from our real-time feed. Backtest your trading strategies to assess performance and viability, conduct transaction cost analysis, and support compliance requirements. Input data into surveillance systems to help detect and prevent abusive or illegal trading activities. Access over 10 years of deep tick history across asset classes. Get tick data for an entire market or on an underlying list of instruments. Access additional securities as needed. With flexible delivery options to complement your workflow. Simplify your historical data management with ICE Data Vault.
Welcome back. Before the break, Barney Reynolds, partner at Shearman and Sterling, and I were discussing the future of the UK's financial services sector following Brexit, as well as the opportunities now available to the UK following its departure from the EU at the end of last year. So, Barney, I suppose it's a truism that all lawyers are writers, but you've taken this all to a new level. You've written 4 books on Brexit, A Blueprint for Brexit, A Template for Enhanced Equivalence, The Art of the New Deal, that's my favorite title, and Free Trade in UK-EU Financial Services. I'm curious, what's your writing process, and who are you writing it for?
After the referendum outcome, as you mentioned earlier, I started writing things explaining what the way forward was for financial services. In fact, the very first thing I wrote was for Thomson Reuters, and it just triggered a sort of deluge of pieces from other people saying, well, no, this can't be done at all. Essentially, I said that the 2 ways forward for financial services were either, in the UK, some sort of equivalence-based, enhanced equivalence-based model, based on the concepts we talked about earlier, but improved upon, or a financial centre model where, and that's where people bring in the Singapore analogy, but I think that's somewhat inaccurate, but where the UK does its own thing and customers come to the market. But it triggered a huge amount of reaction from other people saying that this was just not right. And so I then wrote the Blueprint for Brexit in November 2016, setting out these 2 models in some detail. And then people said, no, you can't do enhanced equivalence and never get that to work. So then I wrote a template for enhanced equivalence, which came out in July 2017. And then they said, well, but there's no plan B, there's no alternative if that's not accepted by the EU. So I then wrote The Art of the No Deal for November 2017. And then in the meantime, then the government decided to accept, in fact, shortly after that, the template for enhanced equivalence concept and as government policy. And then people said, well, you've got no leverage. There's no reason the EU will agree to any of this in terms of your deal. I quite like the idea, but it's never going to be agreed to. So I wrote Managing Euro Risk. I co-authored that with an economist and financial analyst. And that, beginning in March 2019, essentially explained how the Eurozone is constructed in a fatally dangerous way that creates risk, which it then offloads onto the rest of the world. So effectively, it's operating at the rest of the world's expense. And so what I explained in that was how the UK has been mitigating that risk on behalf of the world through Bank of England stress tests and top-up capital requirements on businesses here, acting as a shock absorber for that risk. But everything would change after the end of Brexit with the withdrawal of the passport, which is why the EU needs to accept enhanced equivalence, because then the UK can carry on mitigating that risk. The EU doesn't recognise, let alone manage or mitigate any of this risk itself. And the US, until that book came out, I don't think had really appreciated it because it wasn't factored into US stress tests. And then people said, but there's no real upside in doing anything differently. So that's when I did Restoring UK Law, which just came out in February this year, which set out what I think we need to do, the difference between the common law and civil law code heritage and what we need to do on that. So that's kind of why you're calling me an accidental Brexiteer. I sort of became, the referendum happened, I started writing, and it led to this chain of events where I just set out one thing after another. But no, I hadn't set out to be an author to that degree at all before.
Your mother is a violin teacher. You are an accomplished cellist. As you're thinking about bringing readers on a journey from the first note of a publication to the last word, how does your appreciation of music play a role in creating a narrative on the topics that you're writing about?
There is a connection with music, which is that it's orchestral in a way, writing, I think, because the analysis needs to sort of reach a crescendo and fit together, and there needs to be a reconciliation of the various tunes and subtunes and counterpoints and so on. So I think there is a resonance with music.
In your work beyond this, Barney, you've delved into the creation of entirely new legal and regulatory regimes. For example, at Abu Dhabi Global Markets in the UAE, an international financial center operating under the English common law system that you and I have been talking about, which is also now home to ICE's newest exchange, ICE Futures Abu Dhabi. What considerations have to go into a process like that, bringing a new legal and regulatory regime to an entirely different sovereign place?
There's a general trend which I should perhaps touch on first, that many countries, developing countries around the world are looking, and developed ones are looking to law and regulation and how that can be a competitive advantage or it can be more market friendly. And they're looking at carving out regions or bits of the state to sort of experiment with that. And there have always been sort of for a long time now, decades, been special economic zones. The Abu Dhabi one is a financial free zone. So in fact, in Dubai is DIFC, Dubai International Financial Market. And there was one in Qatar, or there is one in Qatar, there's one in Astana in Kazakhstan. I suppose, and the question then is which are going to be successful and why? And ADGM, which I'm very proud to be, have been involved in, I led a team drafting the laws and regulations for ADGM. And we introduced the common law in its entirety, the first time it's ever been done in a non-colonial context to a country, with all the benefits that brings that we've discussed. It requires a massive leap by a country, and the UAE, I think, has been very innovative in deciding for themselves that the common law was the best system to adopt. And not everyone around the world, I mean, I've been involved in all sorts of other ones where people are more reluctant to make that leap. The Gulf generally is based on French-Egyptian law, sort of code-based law. There are other parts of the world, there are bits of Southeast Asia that have code-based law based on the French model, many of them. And they're not so keen to make that leap. It does mean letting go. It basically, to some extent, involves federalizing the country. And in ADGM, there is a board of Emiratis that effectively comprise the legislature, and they can decide on the rules, but they're happy for common law practitioners, with the judge of the courts, judges being from the common law world, very distinguished legal luminaries from around the common law world, headed up by Lord Hope, who's a brilliant common law lawyer, and the others are excellent, brilliant as well. It's a big leap because you have to be prepared to accept another operating system. So I think it's very impressive that the UAE and Abu Dhabi in particular have been prepared to make that leap. And I think it's paying off. The IFC, which was an earlier financial free zone, formed earlier in the UAE, involved an adoption of the codified version of the common law, which is a sort of slightly betwixt and between system, but with some benefits from the common law. And that's been successful. ADGM's gone the whole hog towards the real case law system. That's probably the most innovative in the world right now. And we'll have to see what the future brings. But I think it's very exciting. And I think it's not before time that people now really appreciate that the benefits of doing law and regulation sensitively and what that brings to entrepreneurialism, to innovation. And as you say, ICE Futures Abu Dhabi, which I think is an extremely innovative venture, trading the Murban crude future for the first time this has been done effectively in the Middle East.
The United Arab Emirates is so far from the United Kingdom, both geographically and also politically, Barney. What made you get involved in the project involving ADGM?
I was asked to meet someone very senior and brilliant Emirati in charge, His Excellency Ahmed Al-Sayegh. And he asked what I'd recommend, and I recommended this model. And he's a visionary man. I think he, and then obviously a lot of others, bought into the idea that this would be the best way to do it. But it's a huge intellectual leap. It required a lot of analysis and thinking in Abu Dhabi as to what they were comfortable with and how it would work, an explanation of how it would interact with everything else in the country. But I think they're seeing the results. I mean, they've got now over, I think it's over 16,000 people there, over 2,400 companies. I mean, it goes up all the time. This is after 5.5 years. I mean, it's an extraordinary result of the sort of mushrooming of business under this architecture, which effectively wasn't there before. People are able to choose any of the three systems they want. For real modern financial business, for innovative services-based business, they're choosing the common law.
So then that leaves the future of the European Union and where it goes from here. Does the bloc need to redefine its policies on financial services and indeed in other areas of trade and commerce?
I don't think so. I mean, these legal systems are sort of go side by side with how one governs oneself and how the country or the society operates. And so, those existing within a codified model are obviously, generally speaking, happy with that. So it's just different. For financial services, I think the common law system is just superior. But I don't think you can easily, if at all, change a large state from one system to another. I don't see that happening. I think the EU is going to become more of what it is in a way, which is it's going to roll out more codified law across industry sectors. I think the euro will become, more and more prominent. I think the Eurozone issues in terms of the risk that I have described it creating will have to be sorted out in the short term. And the only place that can really sort that out is the UK or the City of London in the wholesale market space by providing the liquidity and the skills to be able to keep the show on the road. In 20 or 30 years' time, I would guess there will potentially be the integration of fiscal and monetary arrangements, which would mean that that's not necessary. But I think it's going to be a controlled economy on the codified civil law model. And, that works for bits of industry. You can see that in Northern Europe, for certain types of industry, that method of a controlled economy can produce, good levels of wealth for a lot of people. There will conversely be a common law world, UK, US, Commonwealth, operating on a slightly different model, which I think the difference will become more noticeable, but it's possible very happily to interoperate between the two. It's not a problem trading between these two systems, but within each thought bubble, as it were, the way of reasoning and approach to everything is fundamentally different.
There are these places where it all meets up, though, Barney. I mentioned Northern Ireland in the introduction. You talked about it a little bit in the first part of the show. It's a place that I got to know when I traveled there with President Clinton in 1995 at the beginning of the peace process. In a relatively recent article in the Daily Express, you referred to the Northern Ireland Protocol as, and I'm going to quote here, a sort of land grab by the EU in which a number of people in Northern Ireland find unacceptable, and it was forced through by the EU over their heads. What do you think are the implications of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and what's the best way to manage it?
So where we've got to in Northern Ireland in normalized international law terms is the Good Friday Agreement, and that is an arrangement under which basically Northern Ireland is part of the UK unless everyone votes, a majority votes out, and there are sort of ways of evaluating what that majority is. The Northern Ireland Protocol was agreed as part of the two-step process that the EU insisted on in agreeing a future trade relationship between the UK and the EU after Brexit. And the UK, as we've touched on earlier, the majority of those in charge, at least elected, did not want to leave with no trade deal, i.e. on WTO terms, a so-called hard Brexit. In order to avoid that, the EU said, fine, okay, we'll talk about a trade deal, but only if you sign up to this protocol first. What does the protocol do? It applies EU law for goods and agri-products in Northern Ireland. It applies EU state aid law in Northern Ireland, and also insofar as it touches on competitiveness, has competitiveness implications across the north-south border. It also applies in Great Britain, the mainland. And it gives the European Court of Justice the power to interpret that law, and the European Commission executive authority in terms of applying the state aid law. So effectively, Northern Ireland, for sort of considerable economic purposes, remains part of the EU, but without any votes, because nobody in Northern Ireland has any vote over what happens. Now, it's highly questionable in international law terms whether the arrangement is enforceable. The European Court of Justice itself, in relation to the people of Gibraltar, who at one point weren't being given a vote over EU law, decided that they had to have a vote, which they then did get given, because you can't have people subject to a law without a vote. But there's no way of constructing that for the people of Northern Ireland. I mean, you could say the people in the Republic, the MPs and the MEPs, the members of the European Parliament in the Republic, could exercise a vote in their favour, but that's not they're not elected by the people in Northern Ireland. There's no proper democratic infrastructure around that. So I think it's a highly questionable arrangement, potentially in breach of the Vienna Convention and in its seeking to override national sovereignty. And in fact, when the UK implemented the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, which was an addendum effectively to the withdrawal agreement, negotiated principally by the Theresa May administration. It did so with a section in the statute which said that the UK Parliament remains sovereign. So it's a caveated implementation anyway. Now, the question is, so I don't think it works legally. I don't think it's acceptable on a whole host of fronts, but starting from the democratic. And what it seeks to do with its conceptual architecture is effectively impose a border across the Irish Sea within the UK, which is another absurdity. So the question is, what does work then and is consistent with where we got to with the Good Friday Agreement? Because actually this whole arrangement, as Lord Trimble, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, said, is incompatible with the Good Friday Agreement. It's just an unconscionable incompatibility. The answer is there are two things that would work for the border. The problem to solve for, that we're all agreed that needs to be solved, is an invisible north-south border in the island of Ireland. And there are two ways to achieve that. One is so-called alternative arrangements, and a group of people over here who've put an immense amount of work into creating an analysis around that, essentially drawing on the best border processes from around the world, the highest tech ones, to make that border invisible. The EU rejected that, saying, oh, well, and it involves a sort of stitching together of 20 plus different techniques. And what they did was came up with theoretical gaps where, if someone did X, Y, and Z, this wouldn't be picked up by a particular technique. And there was entirely theoretical process. And it reminds me of, and I think it goes back to the common law, civil law difference. The UK people think in terms of a bottom-up pragmatic approach. The codifier thinks in terms of conceptual architecture. There's the old legal joke, I think French lawyers sometimes make it, and Canadians some. That works all very well in practice, but does it work in theory? And so we had a sort of surreal discussion around that. It was rejected roundly. But there is another way, if that remains unacceptable to the EU, to have an invisible north-south border, which is called mutual enforcement. I've been part of sort of expanding that, but in fact it was something that was originally suggested at a high level by some people in the EU itself, and that basically is conceptually pure. It meets the sort of civilian lawyer test of does it work in theory? It does. It unarguably works in theory, and what it does is to say that it flips the processes on their head and reverses them effectively, so that the exporter country, the country where the exporter is, will conduct the checks and garner any tariffs on behalf of the importer, and vice versa. Obviously, it'd be mutual, which is keep the whole thing honest, and that provides for an invisible border in theory as well as practice, because essentially the UK would be in control of being able to do that. It could be made a criminal offence to evade, willingly or knowingly, to evade these border control processes. And the exporters could easily be set up at the UK's cost within the UK to meet these requirements. I hope that's now adopted.
So as we wrap up, Barney, you've mentioned in the past that the City of London and the Bank of England are key players in mitigating the risk to the global economy as posed by the Eurozone. Sounds like a pretty crucial responsibility. Looking ahead, can you explain the UK's role in this context? What are the weaknesses within the Eurozone?
Well, the weakness stems from the fact that the Eurozone splits sovereignty between federal arrangements for monetary affairs, and the fiscal arrangements are left domestic. The Eurozone seeks to be sovereign for monetary arrangements. But when you split the sovereignty, neither of them has full sovereignty. And yet the EU double counts sovereignty in its law and treats both of them as sovereign. And crucially, it treats member states as fully sovereign in the debt that they issue, which is the underpinnings of any global market. And so that debt is allowed to be held by any financial institution without capital charge. It's allowed to be counted as 100% of its value for collateral purposes and liquidity purposes. It can be treated as fully liquid, and yet that's clearly not true. But what's the result of doing that is that immense risk is created, which is uncaptured by the financial markets. And because the markets are inherently complex, that risk, and the institutions largely within the EU that acquire those debts then don't sit still. They do deals with everyone all over the world. That risk dissipates, putting the assets of savers and investors around the world at risk. What the UK does through its annual stress tests conducted by the Bank of England is model very sort of significant shocks in the Eurozone. And it imposes capital top-up requirements on banks over here to absorb that risk effectively. So people here, or the investors in the banking system here, are effectively paying for the mitigation of that risk. And the EBA, which undertakes the stress test for the Eurozone, it sort of doubles down on the assumptions and doesn't acknowledge it. And you wouldn't expect otherwise in a way, because having created the entire architecture at a rules level, you wouldn't expect it to be reversed out at a supervisory level. But the result of that is that we have this risk which now needs to be mitigated because of Brexit in a different way by the global markets. The UK and actually the US need to find a different way of addressing that risk. There are some other distortions. It contributes to, in fact, trade dumping and unfair subsidization. It produces artificially cheap finance within the Eurozone for exports, as well as internal purposes. Going along with that, Target 2 provides almost unlimited subsidization effectively to Eurozone companies by providing financing to their buyers. And then separately, the euro itself, because of these splits, and for other reasons, is effectively artificially low in value for the northern Eurozone. So essentially, it's a cake and eat it solution where certain countries are getting the benefit of an artificially low currency and subsidization through Target 2 and cheap banking, which is affecting trade around the world as well. So all of this needs to be looked at, and all of this needs to be addressed somehow in order to protect the rest of the world from it, while the EU decides how and when to normalise.
Well, Barney, as we have our cake and eat it and draw our conversation on all things Brexit to a close, what's on the horizon for you? More books, or are you gonna? What's taking up most of your time from here on in?
Just normal advisory work. I don't have any books currently planned, so I'm very much enjoying just my normal work, and looking forward, I hope, to a summer holiday.
Excellent. Well, I think we all are. It's been quite a 5-year journey since that time in June 2016, and a great journey ahead, surely, as we get used to what it's like in a post-Brexit world. Thanks so much, Barney, for bringing us on this journey and for joining us today inside the Ice House.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Josh.
And that's our conversation for this week. Our guest was Barney Reynolds, partner at Shearman & Sterling. If you like what you heard, please rate us on iTunes so other folks know where to find us. And if you've got a comment or a question you'd like one of our experts to tackle on a future show, email us at icehouse@ice.com or tweet at us at IceHousePodcast. Our show was produced by Veronica Slumka and Pete Ash with production assistance from Stephen Romanchik and Ian Wolfe. I'm Josh King, your host, signing off from the Library of the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Information contained in this podcast was obtained in part from publicly available sources and not independently verified. Neither ICE nor its affiliates make any representations or warranties, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information, and do not sponsor, approve, or endorse any of the content herein, all of which is presented solely for informational and educational purposes. Nothing herein constitutes an offer to sell, a solicitation of an offer to buy any security, or a recommendation of any security or trading practice. Some portions of the preceding conversation may have been edited for the purpose of length or clarity.